Driving home, and before you know it, you're back in no time and have missed most of the journey. Conversely, how many times do you sit in a traffic jam for absolutely hours, moving at 0 miles an hour, tapping your fingers on the dashboard, check the clock, and find only 2 minutes has passed?
Travelers, here we meet.
To offer an explanation, let's go back to our imaginary two-dimensional piece of paper world and imagine two two-dimensional beings, Mike and Phil, in their two-dimensional cars at one side of the piece of paper. Both cars are identical, same construction, size, weight and engine. Both Mike and Phil start off from one side of the piece of paper and travel in an identically straight line at exactly the same speed and velocity and arrive at the other side of the piece of paper, except Phil gets there first. How can that be? Well, only being able to perceive the two dimensions of width and length, neither Phil nor Mike are aware of height, so neither of them notice that the piece of paper world is not flat, and rather is quite curvy, and for Mike to arrive last, he has actually taken the route that has the most dips and rises. This is a reasonably good model of time. Like a piece of paper or string, it rises and falls, and can indeed be bent back on itself, and forms all kinds of incredibly tortuous shapes. But, from our perspective, we can't see that, and our brains do their best to arrange it linearly.
Secrets, there be one. The universe is open to all. Questions in the mind, answers rooted deep in our hearts.
So, what is the next dimension beyond time, and how can we access it to see time as it truly is, with a beginning, middle, end, and all the curves and bends? To answer that, we need to go back to Maxwell, and note firstly that each new dimension is at a right angle rotation to the previous. Secondly, from Pythagoras, the extrapolation of dimensions would appear to be infinite, but most scientists who have studied this seem to agree that there are probably only 11. Thirdly, the next dimensions from time can be loosely grouped together as G, which is the mass-free force that acts on curved time to create matter, or what Reich referred to as orgone. Hence, it can be seen in a simple way that it is this G that is the sixth point that defines time, and therefore relative space and reality as and beyond how we know it. Now we can go back to our two crystals with a new understanding of what is happening, and add some more variables and absolutes to the equations. It would seem from Reich's research that the two crystals are acting with the air between them like layers in an orgone accumulator. That is, they are drawing or creating energy within their own microsystem. This can be compared to what happens with something called a standing wave. All energy displays itself as a waveform with a frequency and length, and the length of a waveform that divides equally between the distance of two objects that acts as reflectors, bounces off one, meets itself coming back, and amplifies itself, thereby continually building up and creating a standing wave. This is how most musical instruments work. For example, in a flute, air is vibrated down a tube, and the holes in the tube are at precisely calculated length, such that they create a standing wave of sound at particular frequencies that represent particular notes. This doesn't just happen with sound, but light, current, magnetism, gravitational attraction, and so forth. In fact, we are being not only presented by a plethora of varying and different types of energy, but also standing waves which amplify that energy, and this is what seems to be happening with the two crystals. All substances act very differently with energy, and we know from the technology used in digital watches and computers that crystal has particular properties that work within these energy forms, and therefore acts upon them to manifest change. We noticed that each new dimension occurred at orthogonal right angles to the previous, and this is exactly what Maxwell observed. That just as, for example, a magnetic field in a wire is at right angles to the current flow, other fields and waveforms exist at concurrent dimensional right angles, all of which are merely an expression of the mass-free force of the universe acting on curved time. What this actually means is that these energies aren't then limited between the two crystals, but that they generate more lines of energy either side of the crystals, which you can discover by using your dowsing rod or pendulum. Now, for a minute, let's imagine a single dimension space with 2 points of singularity in it, like our two crystals. Each of these points is already accumulating and generating energy from the mass-free energetic element of the universe, which is projecting at right angles from its single line, as well as out either end, seeking a new point to join. So what happens next? The points not only parent new points in their own singular dimension, but new points in new dimensions at orthogonal right angles to the single dimension. Now we have an almost infinite matrix of super fine energy points and energy lines that by its nature defines the universe, exactly what Maxwell observed in his equations. However, each of the superfine energy lines is reacting with others, in some cases amplifying, in others dampening, and in even others the two energy forms combine to create an entirely new one, all the time generating new points at their intersections. What we end up with is a matrix-like superstructure made of an infinite variance of energy types and forms. But what were the original points, and where did they come from?
I hope you'll never forget.
To answer this, we have to look at a relatively new field of science called quantum theory. Quantum theory came out of the scientific drive to discover the smallest unit that was the building block of the universe as we know it. And quarks, these so-called building blocks, were discovered less because they could be seen under any amazing high-powered microscope, and more because of their effect on other things. Two highly interesting points arise out of this research. The first being that quarks seem to act simultaneously like both a wave and a particle, and secondly, that they seem to react to the expectations of the experimenter. So, although the building blocks of the universe are matter, that is material, they are also pure energy, and therefore appear coincidentally, as Maxwell premised over 100 years before, as a direct result of the mass-free energetic component of the universe itself. If we allow ourselves to be limited to thinking of time as linear. Walking the hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. And yet, were they really erected by Druids marking the position of the planets, or megalithic man tracing the serpentine course of Mother Earth's power lines? Crop circles, an apparently modern phenomenon, may hold the key to understanding these dragons and rings, but to answer these and many other questions, we're going to have to stretch the fabric of reality and look at what really makes the universe tick. In 1921, the rambling enthusiast, photographer and antiquarian Alfred Watkins had, as he put it, a flood of ancestral memory. He was looking at a map of his local Herefordshire when it occurred to him how ancient landmarks and prehistoric places appeared to be in a straight line. After spending some years studying these alignments and photographing them, he wrote about his discoveries in his book, The Old Straight Track, and adopted the name Ley Lines. Ley literally means a woodland clearing or meadow, and comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lair. This has nothing to do with the current understanding of the phrase ley line, and yet maybe Watkins was onto something. Walking the hills and dales, the breadth and depth of England's green and pleasant lands, you are bound to stumble at some point or another into the centre of a ring of weathered and ancient stones, some recumbent, some still standing like the teeth of a long dead dragon that haunted the land. But who built them, and why? These questions have been considered and debated by historians and archaeologists alike since William Stukeley first charted the avenues and structures of Avebury Stone Circle in Wiltshire and brought them back into public consciousness. And yet, were they really erected by Druids marking the position of the planets, or megalithic man tracing the serpentine course of Mother Earth's power lines? Crop circles, an apparently modern phenomenon, may hold the key to understanding these dragons and rings, but to answer these and many other questions, we're going to have to stretch the fabric of reality and look at what really makes the universe tick. In 1921, the rambling enthusiast, photographer and antiquarian Alfred Watkins had, as he put it, a flood of ancestral memory. He was looking at a map of his local Herefordshire when it occurred to him how ancient landmarks and prehistoric places appeared to be in a straight line. After spending some years studying these alignments and photographing them, he wrote about his discoveries in his book, The Old Straight Track, and adopted the name ley lines. Ley literally means a woodland clearing or meadow, and comes from the Anglo-Saxon word lair. This has nothing to do with the current understanding of the phrase ley line, and yet maybe Watkins was onto something, because the word ley is etymologically linked to the word leoth, meaning fire and light. Combining these meanings gives us an understanding of Watkins' perspective, a cleared space open to the light, like for example a trackway through the woods, with the hills being marked by beacons. More recently, the word ley has become linked with the apparent lines of energy that trace their course across the surface of the planet and are known by the ancients as chi or dragon lines. But how do we find them? And what do they do? The most conventional way of detecting ley lines is through the archaic art of El. The name El is listed at the head of many pantheons including Aramaic, Phoenician and Ethiopian, and is a northwest Semitic word for God, the father of gods or the God. It is the root of many words, for example Elohim, the Hebrew for gods, El, the supreme god of the Canaanites, and Elos, the counterpart to the Greek Kronos, time. It finds its way into Celtic mythology in the form of the goddess Bellissima, the most brilliant, otherwise known as Bridget, the consort of Belinus, or Bel, the shining one. We have discovered then that what we call ley lines are in fact an infinite series of multidimensional energy nodes and subsequent threads, and that those that seem strongest to us define our version of what we call reality. The Indian philosophers called this world that we see, literally, illusion. What happens then if we take our multidimensional interactive crystal nodes, scale them up into man-size and bigger crystalline stones, and insert them into this reality matrix of ley lines? Well, first of all, they become part of that matrix, creating new interactions. In the Reichian sense, they accumulate orgone or life energy between themselves, as well as further amplifying that by creating standing waves. These interact with the energetic matrix of the ley lines, creating further electromagnetic gravitational currents at orthogonal right angles, which reach out into space at all levels. Add a few more stones to create a ring, and you not only establish a ring of energy and all its component right angle parts, but also a central vertical core current reaching up and down through the dimensional levels. The stones themselves become a representation of the 3D reality we perceive, much like the Pythagorean dimensional points that define height, breadth, and width, and in themselves act not only to define a sacred or special space within the multidimensional universe, but simultaneously lock it into this reality, as well as act as a multi-dimensional gateway counteract all other realities. This is why they are often aligned to the stars and moon, and most importantly, elements of the solar cycle, because it is precisely these quarter points that would have defined man's reality in relation to his material needs for day-to-day survival. In the Pythagorean model, it is the next node of time that serves to determine how that 3D space interacts within the multidimensional universe. And we find the physical representation not a long way from a stone circle in the form of a king or keystone. According to sacred geometry, measurement in sacred space is very important in how that space is defined according to ancient numerological systems and the association between number and sacred, as well as secular concepts. What I believe is happening here is that the proportional dimensions of the space, defined by its component stone parts, create or amplify particular frequencies. Again, much in the same way that the relative position of holes in a tube creates sound frequencies when the tube is blown that correspond to a musical scale. The king or keystone fulfills a similar role in its interaction with the parent circle in defining how the circle can be used to access multi-dimensional space. Bearing in mind the intent of its creators and how the universe can be modelled on the thoughts and emotions of humans, it is possible to see that if man were so inclined and able to understand these harmonic relationships, they would be able to tune into the energy grid of the planet and choose very carefully those places to build not only stone circles, but other standing stones and other structures that were not only isolated multidimensional gateways, but also had an interaction between each of them, joining them into a massive, world-covered superstructure, like a gigantic, intergalactic computer. Many ancient cultures have mythologies that not only tie their place of birth or origin into the stars and particular star systems, but also the place where their spirits go to at death. It is interesting to note that many people entering stone circle or burial mounds notice an elevated sense of consciousness, often tuning into beings from another dimension, such as fairies, pixies, and extraterrestrials, and sometimes even noticing time anomalies. It is much more likely that we are tuning into higher and indeed lower states of living energy and holographically projecting a representation of that energy into our three-dimensional reality. Astral projection, or out-of-body experiences, similarly take us into altered states of reality and consciousness, where a person finds themselves lucidly interacting in another time, place, or reality. This process again is found to be amplified or manifested within stone circles and other similar structures. And now we're back where we started, in the centre of a ring of ancient stones. An interdimensional time capsule built tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But was it by chance, or by accident, or by design? Are we alone, or is the truth really out there?